27 women.
That's the number listed in a private ledger unearthed in 1978, concealed behind a false wall in what used to be the Tidewater District Magistrate's office in southeastern Virginia. 27 enslaved women who vanished from plantations across the region between March and November of 1847. Their disappearances were recorded with an unsettling degree of order, as though the person documenting them felt compelled to leave a record, but terrified of letting it reach official hands. The entries are disturbingly precise: names, ages, physical descriptions, dates of last sighting, all written in the same calm practice script that appears on county marriage licenses and property transfers from that era. But it's the notes added later, penned in a different ink, that turn this ledger from troubling to horrifying. Next to each woman's name, a single word appears, always the same: found. When authorities finally connected these disappearances, what they uncovered revealed a scheme so calculated, so cold in its execution, that Virginia's planter class locked itself into a silence that lasted more than a century. And the truth of what happened along the James River in 1847 is far darker than any rumor that survived. Before we continue with this chapter of buried history, make sure you're subscribed to Vintage Truths. Hit that notification bell and drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from, because some of the darkest chapters in American history happened much closer to home than most people want to imagine. The discovery of that ledger wasn't accidental. It came to light during renovations when workers tearing down interior walls in the old magistrates' building found more than just the hidden compartment. They found correspondence, financial records, and a series of maps marked with symbols that initially made no sense. It would take historians 3 years to piece together what those documents really meant. And when they did, several refused to publish their findings. The ones who did face pressure from descendants of prominent Virginia families who claimed the research was sensationalist, designed to tarnish reputations built over 2 centuries. But the evidence was there, preserved in the very materials those families' ancestors had used to build their fortunes. The spring of 1847 found Virginia's plantation country in quiet prosperity, masking deeper anxieties. The James River corridor from Richmond to the Chesapeake Bay represented some of the South's most valuable agricultural land. Tobacco remained king, though soil exhaustion was already becoming apparent. The great plantations stood as monuments to a way of life dependent on enslaved labor, whose numbers in Tidewater, Virginia had swelled to nearly twice the white population. This demographic reality bred constant fear. Nat Turner's rebellion just 16 years past, and 50 miles south remained fresh in memory. Every unexplained absence sent ripples of paranoia through the white community. Slave patrols rode at night, authorized to stop any black person found away from their place of enslavement. Into this atmosphere came subtle changes few noticed at first. The Hanover County plantation of Josiah Hendress reported that Dinah, aged 24, with a scar above her left eyebrow, had run away in mid-March. The advertisement offered $20 reward, but Dinah was never found. Neither was Sarah from the Langford plantation 3 weeks later, nor Mary from the Gaines property in May. By summer, plantation owners along 30 miles of the James were quietly discussing a problem. Enslaved women were vanishing, and despite extensive slave patrols and professional catchers, they weren't being recovered. The pattern was unusual. Only women aged 18 to 35 disappeared, targeting mid-sized plantations with 50 to 150 enslaved people. Most disturbing, the women left behind children. Enslaved mothers almost never ran away from their children. The bonds of family were stronger than iron shackles. Yet here were women vanishing who had sons, daughters, some still nursing infants. The spring rains that year were particularly heavy, swelling the James River and its tributaries, flooding low-lying fields, and making the back roads nearly impossible for weeks at a time. The mud, the isolation of properties separated by swaths of dense pine forest and swampland, the chaos of planting season, all these factors created conditions where absences might not be immediately noticed. A woman sent to work in a distant tobacco field might not be missed for days. By the time someone realized she was gone, any trail would be cold. At the Grantham plantation on a river bend, overseer Marcus Haywood noticed something troubling. 3 women from different work gangs vanished within 2 weeks in July. None had seemed discontent or received recent punishment. All 3 disappeared on foggy mornings when visibility dropped before sunrise. Haywood walked the property line searching for tracks, broken branches, any sign of direction. He found nothing, as if they dissolved into the mist rising off the river. The enslaved community maintained careful silence. Those questioned, sometimes brutally, claimed to know nothing. But among themselves, theories spread. An underground railroad conductor, slave traders stealing for the Deep South, or something darker from old stories about people who entered swamps and never returned. By August, a meeting was called at Hanover County Courthouse, limited to affected plantation owners and overseers. 23 men gathered and laid out the scope. 19 women had vanished since March. The financial loss was staggering. Each woman represented 800, 200 plus future labor. But more than money, the situation threatened the entire control structure. If people realized they could disappear without being caught, the psychological impact could be catastrophic. They discussed increasing patrols, larger rewards, professional slave catchers from Maryland and North Carolina. Most resisted involving state militia. It meant public admission, newspaper attention, potentially sparking panic or more escape attempts. Instead, they pulled resources, hiring men whose reputation for tracking runaways was established. The tracking party arrived in early September, led by Tobias Fletcher, a man in his 42nds with pale, unblinking eyes, who'd built his career returning fugitives from as far as Pennsylvania. He'd brought 4 associates, each experienced in hunting human beings. They set up in a tavern outside Richmond, studying maps, reviewing descriptions, interviewing anyone who might have information. Fletcher's method was systematic. People left traces, needed food and shelter. Someone always knew something. What Fletcher discovered in his first week of investigation would prove more unsettling than the disappearances themselves. Fletcher's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A free black waterman named Elijah Dobbs, who operated a small ferry crossing about 15 miles downriver from Richmond. Dobbs was careful, as all free black people had to be in Virginia, maintaining good relationships with white customers while avoiding anything that might threaten his precarious legal status. But Fletcher had a reputation for paying for information, and Dobbs had something to sell. On a humid Tuesday evening, as the last light faded and insects swarmed in clouds above the river, Dobbs told Fletcher about the boats. He'd seen them 3 times over the past 6 months, always at night, always moving downriver with the current, always manned by TW. Or 3 figures who knew how to handle watercraft with unusual skill. The boats were clinker-built, the kind used for river trade. Nothing remarkable about them, except that they passed in darkness, without lights, which was both dangerous and suspicious. Boats traveling at night usually carried lanterns to avoid collisions and snags. These vessels moved dark and quiet, visible only when the moon was bright enough to catch the gleam of water on oar blades. The last time he'd seen one, perhaps 6 weeks ago, Dobbs had been checking his ferry lines near midnight when he heard the soft splash of oars. He'd stepped into the shadows and watched. The boat had passed within 30 feet of where he stood. He couldn't make out faces in the darkness, but he'd seen something that stuck with him. The silhouettes of multiple people sitting in the boat who never moved, never spoke, just sat perfectly still as the vessel slipped downstream. Something about their stillness had been wrong. Living people, even trying to be quiet, shifted and breathed and adjusted their positions. These figures might have been statues. Fletcher absorbed this information without visible reaction, paid Dobbs $5, and added a quiet warning. If the waterman mentioned this conversation to anyone else, Fletcher would ensure he regretted it. Free papers could be challenged, lost, declared forgeries. Dobbs understood perfectly over the next several days. Fletcher expanded his investigation along the river, talking to other watermen, fishermen, people who lived along the banks and might have seen unusual activity. Most claimed ignorance, but patterns emerged. Scattered reports of boats moving at night. A ferryman near Shirley Plantation who'd noticed the water unexpectedly rough one morning, suggesting heavy traffic during the night. A fisherman who'd found fresh footprints on a sandbar where no one should have been walking. The more Fletcher learned, the more certain he became that the river itself was the key. The James River system was extensive, with dozens of creeks and tributaries branching into the interior, many navigable by small boat. Someone using waterways could move people without leaving tracks on roads, could bypass the system of checkpoints and patrols that made overland escape so difficult. But this raised new questions. Where were they going? The river led eventually to the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic beyond. But you couldn't simply row enslaved women to freedom. Even reaching northern states required careful planning, safe houses, contacts. The Underground Railroad existed, but its routes generally ran overland, and it certainly didn't have the capacity to move nearly 20 women in a matter of months. Fletcher decided to stake out a promising location, a bend in the river where the current slowed, and a natural channel led to a small inlet surrounded by thick forest. It was isolated enough to serve as a meeting point, yet accessible to anyone who knew the waterways. He chose a moonless night in mid-September and positioned himself on high ground overlooking the inlet, accompanied by one of his men. They settled in before dusk, prepared to wait until dawn if necessary. The night was thick with sound. Cicadas, frogs, the occasional splash of fish or muskrat. The air hung heavy and still, pressing down like a wet blanket. Hours passed. Fletcher's companion shifted restlessly, swatting mosquitoes, but Fletcher himself barely moved. He'd spent countless nights like this, watching and waiting. Patience was his greatest skill. Around 2 a.m, when fatigue was making everything seem unreal, Fletcher heard it, the soft rhythmic sound of OEs cutting water. He touched his companion's arm, and both men went motionless. A boat materialized from the darkness upstream, moving with the current. As it drew closer, Fletcher could make out 3 figures, 2 rowing, 1 in the stern. The boat turned into the inlet and grounded softly on the muddy bank. What happened next unfolded quickly. The 2 rowers, both appear to be white men, though it was difficult to be certain in the darkness, stepped out and secured the boat. They waited, silent and watchful. Perhaps 15 minutes passed. Then came the sound Fletcher had been anticipating. Movement through the forest, branches rustling, footsteps trying and failing to be quiet. A group emerged from the trees, 5 or 6 people, difficult to count in the shadows. The figures moved toward the boat with what looked like reluctance, urged forward by someone behind them carrying what might have been a long pole or stick. Fletcher had seen enough. He stood, called out for them to stop in the name of the law, and started down the slope toward the inlet. His companion followed, both men moving fast. The people at the boat scattered in different directions, all except the 2 who'd been rowing, and one other figure who stood frozen for a moment before turning and running into the forest. Fletcher's companion took chase while Fletcher himself made for the boat, determined to prevent it from being pushed back into the current. He nearly reached it before one of the rowers came at him with an oar, swinging it like a club. Fletcher had anticipated violence and ducked under the swing, catching the man around the waist and driving him to the ground. They grappled in the mud while the second rower shoved the boat into deeper water and jumped aboard, rowing frantically into the darkness. Fletcher could hear his companion crashing through the underbrush somewhere in the forest, could hear screaming, high-pitched and terrified, coming from multiple directions. The fight lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the man fled. Cher was grappling with went limp in his arms. For a moment, Fletcher thought he'd knocked him unconscious. Then he smelled it, the distinctive metallic scent of blood, warm and viscous, soaking into the mud beneath them. The man had fallen onto something sharp in the struggle, a broken branch, or perhaps a knife that had tumbled from his belt. The wound was deep in the abdomen, and the man was making a wet gurgling sound that Fletcher recognized. He'd heard it before. It was the sound of someone dying. Fletcher stood breathing hard and looked around. The boat was gone, disappeared into the darkness downstream. His companion was still somewhere in the forest, and lying in the mud, clutching the mortal wound in his belly, was a white man who would be dead within minutes. Fletcher knelt beside him, trying to make out his features in the darkness. The man's eyes were open, staring up at nothing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who are you?" Fletcher demanded. "Who's running this operation?" The dying man's lips moved, but no sound came out except that awful wet gurgling. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. His eyes fixed on Fletcher's face with something that might have been recognition or might have been the blank stare of approaching death. Then his body went still. Fletcher's companion emerged from the trees minutes later, alone and empty-handed. He'd chased someone for perhaps a quarter-mile before losing them in the dense undergrowth. The other people, the ones who'd been herded toward the boat, had scattered completely. The forest had swallowed them all. They searched the immediate area by moonlight and found signs of recent activity. Trampled vegetation, scraps of cloth caught on branches, the imprint of many feet in the soft earth near the bank. But most importantly, they found something that changed everything, hidden in the bushes near where the boat had been moored was a canvas sack, probably dropped in the panic of Fletcher's arrival. Inside were documents, papers with names and descriptions, what looked like bills of sale, and a ledger recording dates and locations. Fletcher carried the dead man's body and the sack back to his horse, working quickly before dawn broke. He needed to examine everything more carefully, and he needed to identify the dead man. Someone would be looking for him. Someone would need to explain what he'd been doing at that inlet in the middle of the night, helping to load people onto a boat headed down the James River. What Fletcher discovered in those documents would crack the case open like a rotten egg, revealing something far worse than a simple escape operation. The dead man's name was Jacob Puit, and he'd been employed as a clerk at the Richmond office of Sutherland and Company, one of Virginia's largest slave trading firms. This information sent Fletcher's investigation in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Slave traders dealt in human property, buying and selling people for profit, but they operated within a legal framework, maintaining records and paying taxes. They didn't typically run clandestine operations in the middle of the night, except the documents the Fletcher found suggested exactly that. The ledger listed names, dates, and what appeared to be prices paid and received. Most entries were straightforward enough. Purchases from estates, sales to plantation owners in Alabama and Mississippi, the routine transactions of the domestic slave trade. But there was a separate section written in a different hand that recorded something else entirely. These entries listed only first names or initials along with dates and cryptic location codes. The amounts noted were significantly lower than market value, sometimes less than half what a healthy young woman should command. Fletch. Eyre spent 2 days studying the papers before approaching the authorities. He understood the delicate nature of what he'd uncovered. Sutherland Company was a respected firm with connections throughout Virginia's planter class. Accusing them of criminal activity without ironclad proof would be professionally suicidal. But the evidence was compelling, and Pui's death at the scene of an obvious smuggling operation gave Fletcher legal standing to push further. The magistrate he finally approached was George Reynolds, a man in his 52nds who'd served Hanover County for 2 decades and knew every prominent family in the region. Reynolds examined Fletcher's evidence with an expression that grew progressively darker. When he finally looked up, his first words were not what Fletcher expected. "How many people know about this?" Fletcher had brought no one else. Reynolds nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd been thinking. Then he explained what Fletcher's investigation had stumbled into. The domestic slave trade was Virginia's dirty secret, though everyone knew it existed. The state's exhausted tobacco lands couldn't support the population of enslaved people that generations of natural increase had created. Meanwhile, the cotton boom in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas created insatiable demand for labor. Virginia had become a breeding ground and export center, selling people south by the thousands every year. Families were separated, children torn from mothers, husbands from wives, all perfectly legal under Virginia law. The trade was brutal but profitable, and many prominent families supplemented their declining agricultural income through these sales. But even within this system, there were lines that weren't supposed to be crossed. Enslaved people sold south were supposed to be legally owned, properly documented, their sale recorded and taxed. What Fletcher had uncovered was something different. A network that was taking enslaved women without documentation, moving them downriver, and presumably selling them in markets where no one would ask questions about their origin. This wasn't just illegal, it was theft from other slaveholders, a violation of the property rights that formed the foundation of the entire system. Reynolds' concern wasn't humanitarian. He didn't care about the women being taken except as items of stolen property. What worried him was the threat to social stability. If plantation owners couldn't trust that their human property was secure, if there was an organized network stealing enslaved people for profit, it undermined everyone's investment. Worse, if this became public knowledge, it could create exactly the kind of scandal that abolitionists in the North loved to publicize, making Virginia look like a lawless territory where even slaveholders weren't safe from theft. The magistrate decided that Fletcher's investigation would continue, but quietly. No public announcements, no newspaper coverage beyond the routine runaway advertisements that had already appeared. Reynolds himself would contact certain plantation owners, those whose women had disappeared, and arrange for a private meeting. Meanwhile, Fletcher would follow the trail downstream, trying to determine where the boats were going and who was receiving the stolen property. This is where the investigation took its darkest turn. Fletcher traveled downriver following the James toward the Chesapeake, questioning dock workers and tavern keepers. The trail led to City Point, where the Appomattox joined the James. Here, information came easier. What Fletcher sought wasn't unusual. It was business as usual. 3 witnesses confirmed boats matching his description at City Point docks, arriving after dark, departing before dawn. Cargo had been transferred to larger vessels bound for southern ports. No one found this strange. Enslaved people moved through City Point constantly, shipped to Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, New Orleans. No one looked closely at documents or asked uncomfortable questions. Fletcher identified the Catherine Marie, a coastal trader making regular runs to Charleston. Its June manifest listed 32 enslaved people. Comparing with Puett's ledger, the correlations were obvious. At least 6 disappeared. Women had likely been on that ship under different names described as legally owned property, though actually stolen. The scheme's beauty was its simplicity. Virginia's domestic trade moved thousands monthly. Documentation was often sloppy for distant sales. A woman from Hanover County could be given a false name described as property of a fictitious owner selling due to debt and shipped to Charleston where no one would connect her to a Richmond advertisement. She'd be sold at auction, money flowing to conspirators while the original owner absorbed the loss. But this raised the question that Fletcher couldn't answer. How were they taking the women in the first place? Enslaved people didn't just wander off plantations. They were watched, controlled, their movements restricted and supervised. Yet nearly 30 women had been removed without apparent struggle, without witnesses, without anyone seeing enough to sound an alarm until they were already gone. The more Fletcher learned about the distribution network, the less he understood about the initial abduction. The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the women who disappeared managed to come back. Her name was Rachel, and she'd been taken from a plantation in Gouchenan County in early August. She reappeared in late September, walking into the county courthouse in a state of near collapse, barely able to speak, her feet bloodied and her clothin' torn. What she told authorities once they got her water and somewhere to sit would explain everything and nothing, revealing a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone had imagined while raising questions that could never be fully answered. Rachel's story began on an August morning when she'd been working in the tobacco fields. An overseer, not the one assigned to her gang, someone she'd never seen before, had called her name and told her the plantation owner wanted to see her immediately. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. She'd followed the man toward the main house, wondering what she'd done wrong, already preparing herself for punishment. But instead of taking her to the main house, the overseer had led her to a wagon waiting on a side road where two other women from neighboring plantations were already sitting, looking confused and frightened. Before Rachel could run or scream, she'd been grabbed. A cloth soaked in something sweet-smelling had been pressed over her face, and darkness had swallowed her. She'd woken hours later in the hold of a boat, her wrists bound, her head pounding, unable to see anything in the complete blackness below deck. She could hear other women breathing around her, could hear the creak of wood and the splash of water against the hull. The boat had been moving downriver. What followed existed in fragments, darkness, being moved between locations, examined by men speaking about her as livestock, held in a warehouse near water where she heard ships and smelled salt air, then chaos, shouting, something breaking, running. In the confusion, Rachel slipped away and hid. Her journey back took 2 weeks traveling at night, stealing food, drinking from streams, following the North Star and river. She had no clear memory of captors' faces, no names, only that some were white and at least one was black, possibly enslaved and forced to participate. The drug left her memories hazy. Rachel's return confirmed Fletcher's theory. An organized network had been systematically kidnapping women, drugging them, moving them downriver, holding them near City Point before shipping them south. The operation required insider knowledge of which plantations to target when overseers would be distracted. It required resources, boats, holding facilities, southern market contacts, and it required ruthlessness, a willingness to kidnap and sell human beings with no regard for violence or property law. Fletcher had identified the distribution method. He had Jacob Puig's ledger connecting Sutherland and Company to the illegal sales. He had Rachel's testimony about the kidnapping process. What he didn't have was the identity of the person running the operation, the individual who'd planned everything and profited most from it. That would require one more piece of evidence, one more break in the case that would come from the last place anyone expected. The meeting at Eagle Tavern in Richmond gathered 14 plantation owners, Fletcher, 2 sheriffs, and Thomas Waverly, a young attorney from the governor's office. Reynolds presented Fletcher's findings: nighttime boats, Puig's death and ledger, Sutherland and Company-S connection, Rachel's testimony about being drugged and held captive. The mood shifted from anger to something darker as the conspiracy's scope became clear. These weren't runaway slaves. This was theft by other members of their own class, people they did business with, attended church with, shared social obligations with. Discussion grew heated. Some wanted immediate raids on Sutherland and Company public prosecution, but Reynolds and others urged caution. James Sutherland sat on 3 bank boards, had served in the legislature. Accusing him without absolute proof would trigger years of legal battles, destroying reputations. Thomas Waverly added another concern: publicity. Abolitionists would seize this as proof of systemic corruption, argue for federal intervention. Better to handle it quietly, prosecute without fanfare, avoid giving ammunition to slavery's enemies. Fletcher listened to all this with growing frustration. He was being paid to solve a mystery, and he'd solved it. The criminals were identifiable. The evidence was solid. That should be the end of the matter. But as he listened to these wealthy men debate strategy and public relations, he began to understand that the truth was more complicated than he'd realized. Discussion focused on a crucial question. The women sold south. Rachel had escaped, but she was the only one. The others, 26 women, were scattered across plantations from Carolina to Louisiana, living under false names, unable to prove their true identity. Recovering them would be nearly impossible, requiring multi-state cooperation and proof of ownership established months after the fact. Harrison Wickham, who'd lost 2 women, made a stunning proposal. Let it go. Accept the financial loss. Shut down the network, but don't pursue prosecution that would expose everything publicly. The women were gone, already sold. Bringing them back would require admitting Virginia's system of patrols and documentation was weak enough that a gang had stolen 30 people over months. Better to handle it privately, ensure it didn't happen again, and move on. Several agreed. Waverly objected. If unpunished, other networks would form. Law meant nothing unenforced, especially when criminals came from the same class as victims. The debate raged for another hour before Reynolds proposed compromise. Continue investigating to identify everyone involved, deal with them privately through forced restitution and social ostracism, but no public trial, and the women so. LD South would remain where they were. The cost of recovery, financial and political, was too high. Fletcher found this distasteful but understood its logic. The system cared about property rights, not human welfare. If plantation owners accepted the loss to avoid embarrassment, that was their choice. He would complete his investigation, identify remaining conspirators, collect payment, and move on. But what he discovered next made that resolution impossible. Following the money in Puitt's ledger led Fletcher to Samuel Ridgway, a Bank of Virginia clerk processing transfers from Sutherland and Company to individuals whose names appeared on no official business records. When confronted, Ridgway collapsed, confessing everything in a tearful breakdown. Ridgway explained the operation. James Sutherland had conceived the plan. Recognizing Virginia's slave trading business faced increasing criticism and uncertain prospects, he decided to maximize profits while the system still existed, even if that meant stepping outside legal boundaries. Sutherland recruited employees, including Puitt, for kidnapping and transportation, targeting plantations where security was lax, overseers drunk or incompetent, where large numbers of enslaved people made absences less noticeable. The drugging technique came from Dr. Marcus Etterbrook, who provided compounds to render someone unconscious without killing them. The holding facility was a City Point warehouse owned by a shipping company. Sutherland had stakes in forged paperwork was created by lawyer Philip Ardmore, who specialized in estate sales and had access to needed seals and signatures. Everyone involved received handsome payment shares of profits, far exceeding legal work. The operation had run nearly 8 months before Fletcher caught Puitt. In that time, they'd stolen and sold 27 women, generating approximately $22,000, a staggering sum split among conspirators. But here's what made Fletcher's blood run cold. Ridgway claimed that Sutherland had planned to expand the operation, targeting enslaved men as well, and potentially extending into other states. The success of the initial phase had convinced him that the risk was manageable, that authorities were too incompetent or too concerned with avoiding scandal to seriously investigate. He'd been proven partially right. The investigation had taken months to make progress, and even now the plantation owners were more concerned with avoiding publicity than pursuing justice. Fletcher took Ridgway's confession directly to Magistrate Reynolds, expecting that this new evidence would force action. Surely, with a complete confession naming all the conspirators, prosecution would be unavoidable. But Reynolds's reaction was not what Fletcher anticipated. The magistrate read the confession slowly, his face betraying nothing. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Fletcher with something that might have been pity. "You've done excellent work," Reynolds said, "truly exceptional. But I'm afraid the matter is now out of our hands." What Reynolds explained next revealed a layer of corruption that Fletcher hadn't even suspected. James Sutherland had connections that extended far beyond business relationships. His brother-in-law sat on the Virginia Supreme Court. His first cousin was a ranking member of the state legislature. His business partners included 2 of the men who'd attended the meeting at the Eagle Tavern, plantation owners who'd publicly expressed outrage while privately sharing in the profits of the kidnapping operation. The investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that implicated some of the most powerful people in Virginia. Prosecuting them publicly would require confronting families that had control. The state's economy and politics for generations. It would mean exposing a network of corruption that went far beyond one slave trading company, revealing how thoroughly the pursuit of profit had corrupted institutions that were supposed to uphold law and order. The political fallout would be enormous. Reynolds informed Fletcher that his services were no longer required. The investigation was being closed. Fletcher would receive payment for his work, plus a generous bonus for his discretion, but any records he'd collected should be turned over to the magistrate's office immediately. The confession Samuel Ridgway had provided would disappear into a locked cabinet, along with Jacob Puig's ledger and all other evidence Fletcher had gathered. Fletcher protested, argued, threatened to go public himself with what he'd learned, but Reynolds was ready for this response. Going public would accomplish nothing, the magistrate explained patiently. Fletcher had no documents. Reynolds would see to that. He had no credible witnesses. Ridgway would recant his confession. Rachel's testimony would be dismissed as unreliable, and everyone else involved would deny everything. A professional slave catcher accusing prominent citizens of conspiracy would be seen as a man trying to shake them down for money. Fletcher's reputation would be destroyed, his career ended, and he might even face criminal charges for slander. The system was protecting itself, closing ranks against the truth. Fletcher understood that he'd lost before he'd even realized he was in a fight. He accepted his payment, handed over his records, and left Virginia the following week, never to return. But the story didn't end there. Samuel Ridgway's body was discovered in the James River 3 days after his confession, tangled in tree roots near the Rocket's landing docks in Richmond. The official determination was suicide, by drowning, a man overcome by guilt and despair. No one mentioned that his hands had been bound before he went into the water, or that bruises around his throat suggested he'd been unconscious before he drowned. The sheriff who examined the body noted these details in his private journal, but signed off on suicide for the public record. Dr. Marcus Esbrook left Virginia in early November, supposedly to take a position at a hospital in Baltimore. He never arrived there. His carriage was found abandoned on a road north of Fredericksburg. One wheel broken, the horses gone, no sign of the doctor himself. Another mysterious disappearance in a year that had seen too many. The authorities conducted a brief search, but concluded that Estabrook had probably been robbed and killed by highwaymen. His body hidden somewhere in the dense forest along the road. The case was never solved. Philip Ardmore, the lawyer who'd forged the documents, developed a sudden interest in moving west. He sold his practice in Richmond and departed for Tennessee, where he supposedly planned to start fresh. According to records, he did establish a new practice in Memphis, but he died less than a year later from what was described as a fever. He was 38 years old and had been in good health. The pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention. Everyone who'd participated in the conspiracy at an operational level was either dead or driven out of Virginia within months of Fletcher's investigation being shut down. The people who'd actually done the work of kidnapping, drugging, transporting, and documenting the stolen women were being systematically eliminated, ensuring their silence permanently. Only the highest level of the conspiracy, James Sutherland and his partners among the plantation elite, remained untouched. The enslaved community in Tidewater, Virginia, meanwhile, noticed that the disappearances stopped. No more women vanished from tobacco fields or quarters in the night. The boats moving silently down the James River were no longer seen by watermen working late hours. Whatever had been happening was over, shut down as suddenly as it had begun. But the knowledge of what had occurred spread through whispered conversations, becoming part of the oral history that enslaved people passed down to their children. Be careful. Trust no one, because even those who claim to own you legally might find ways to make you disappear entirely. Rachel, the woman who'd escaped and testified, found herself in an impossible position. Her owner, upon her return, had been pleased to recover his property, but deeply unhappy about her involvement in the investigation. Her testimony had embarrassed him, forced him to acknowledge publicly that his plantation security was inadequate. Within a month of Fletcher's departure from Virginia, Rachel was sold south legally, this time with proper documentation, to a cotton plantation in Alabama. The official reason was that she'd become difficult and unreliable, unsuitable for work in Virginia. The real reason was that she knew too much, and her presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of a scandal everyone wanted to forget. The only person from the investigation who remained in Virginia and attempted to pursue the matter further was Thomas Waverly. The young attorney who'd represented the governor's office, Waverly had been appalled by how the case was handled, by the blatant corruption and the willingness of authorities. to protect criminals because of their social status. He wrote a detailed report to the governor describing everything he'd learned and recommending prosecution, despite the political difficulties. The governor never responded to this report. Instead, Waverly was quietly reassigned to administrative duties that kept him far from any real legal work. When he persisted in raising concerns about the case, he found himself increasingly isolated, his colleagues avoiding him, his superiors making it clear that his career prospects depended on his ability to understand when silence was appropriate. Waverly held out for 6 months before resigning his position and leaving Virginia entirely, joining a law practice in Philadelphia, where he later became involved with the abolitionist movement. By the end of 1848, 14 months after the first disappearances, the entire affair had been successfully buried. Sutherland and Company continued operating as if nothing had happened, though James Sutherland himself gradually withdrew from day-to-day management, installing his son-in-law as the public face of the business. The plantation owners who'd lost women absorbed their financial losses and moved on. The criminal network that had kidnapped nearly 30 people was completely dismantled, its members dead, departed, or thoroughly intimidated into silence. But there was one loose end that no one had anticipated, one piece of evidence that survived the cover-up. In early December 1848, a package arrived at the office of the Richmond Enquirer, the city's leading newspaper. Inside was a letter and a copy of documents. Not the originals that Fletcher had been forced to surrender, but copies he'd apparently made before turning over his evidence. The letter explained in clear, detailed prose exactly what had happened: the systematic kidnapping of enslaved women, the conspiracy involving prominent citizens, the investigation that had been shut down to avoid scandal, the subsequent deaths and disappearances of witnesses. The letter was signed, a friend of justice, but the newspaper's editor, John Pleasance, recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Thomas Waverly, though Waverly had been careful not to include an I thing that could prove he'd sent it. Attached to the letter were copies of Puey's ledger, Ridgway's confession, and a list of the 27 women who'd been stolen and sold south, including the names of their original owners and the approximate dates they disappeared. Pleasance faced a difficult decision. Publishing this material would create exactly the kind of scandal that Virginia's elite had worked so hard to prevent. It would expose corruption at the highest levels of society, embarrass powerful families, and likely provoke retaliation against the newspaper and Pleasance himself. But it was also an extraordinary story, the kind of investigative revelation that newspapers existed to bring to light. And Pleasance, despite his own background as a slaveholder, had growing doubts about the institution he was part of. He sat on the material for 3 days, reading and rereading the documents, consulting with his editorial staff, trying to decide what the right course of action was. Finally, he made his choice. He would publish an edited version of the story, focusing on the kidnapping conspiracy itself, while leaving out specific names of the most prominent citizens involved. This way, the truth would enter the public record without causing complete political chaos. The story ran in the Richmond Enquirer on December 12, 1848, under the headline, "Organized Theft of Slave Property Exposed in Tidewater Counties." It described in general terms how a criminal network had systematically stolen enslaved women and sold them south, how the conspiracy had involved people within the slave trading industry, and how authorities had failed to properly prosecute the crimes. It named Jacob Puet, already dead and unable to sue for defamation, and mentioned Sutherland and Company in connection with Puet's employment, though it stopped short of accusing James Sutherland directly. The reaction was immediate and intense. Other Virginia newspapers picked up the story, some running their own investigations, others dismissing it as sensationalist nonsense. Northern abolitionist papers seized on the article as proof that the slave system was inherently corrupt, using it as ammunition in the ongoing political debates about slavery's expansion into Western territories. Pro-slavery advocates in Virginia denounced the coverage as exaggerated and harmful to the state's reputation. James Sutherland himself published a statement denying any wrongdoing, claiming that Pewitt had been a rogue employee acting without authorization and threatening legal action against anyone who suggested otherwise. Several of the plantation owners who'd lost women wrote letters to the editor confirming that disappearances had occurred, but expressing confidence that they were due to escapes rather than kidnapping. Magistrate Reynolds issued a brief statement saying that his office had investigated the matter thoroughly and found no evidence of conspiracy beyond one reckless criminal who'd since died. But the damage was done. The story was out in the world, impossible to completely suppress. The facts might be disputed, details might remain hidden, but the basic truth had entered public consciousness. Something terrible had happened along the James River. In 1847, enslaved women had vanished, and the authorities had failed to protect even the property rights they claimed to hold sacred. John Pleasance paid a price for publishing the story. 3 weeks after it appeared, he was challenged to a duel by the son of one of the men implicated in Waverly's documents. The duel was ostensibly about an unrelated editorial, but everyone understood the real reason. Pleasance accepted the challenge as honor demanded and was killed by a pistol shot to the chest on a cold morning in January 1849. He was 40 years old. The killing of a newspaper editor for publishing an inconvenient truth shocked even Virginia's duel-accustomed society. There were calls for prosecution, but dueling occupied a strange legal space, officially illegal but socially tolerated among gentlemen. The man who'd killed Pleasance faced no serious consequences. The message was clear. Some truths were dangerous to speak, and those who spoke them did so at their own risk. Yet, despite all the efforts at suppression, despite the deaths and the cover-ups and the threats, the story survived. It passed into Virginia's historical record as a strange incident from the antebellum period. Details murky and disputed, but the basic outline preserved. And slowly, very slowly, pieces of additional evidence emerged over the years that confirmed what Waverly and Fletcher had uncovered. The full truth of what happened in 1847 wouldn't come to light until more than a century. Later, when the documents discovered during the 1978 renovation were authenticated and cross-referenced with other historical records that had survived in various archives. What those documents revealed was even darker than anyone in 1848 had imagined. James Sutherland had indeed conceived and run the kidnapping operation, but he hadn't acted alone or even been the primary beneficiary. The conspiracy included at least 7 prominent plantation owners, men who'd sat in the Eagle Tavern expressing outrage while knowing full well what had happened to the missing women. These men had been equal partners in the scheme, providing information about which plantations to target, helping to arrange the kidnappings and sharing in the profits when the women were sold south. The reason for their involvement was cold economic calculation. Virginia's slave economy was in decline. Everyone could see it, but few were willing to admit it publicly. These men had watched their wealth slowly eroding as tobacco exhausted their soil and younger sons of established families moved west to seek better opportunities. The kidnapping operation offered a way to extract additional profit from the enslaved people they controlled, converting them into cash that could be invested in more promising ventures like railroads and manufacturing. But the financial records that survived revealed something even more disturbing about the operation's scope. The 27 women documented in the magistrate's ledger weren't the only victims. They were just the ones whose disappearances had been officially noticed and recorded. Cross-referencing plantation records, sale documents from southern markets, and testimony that had been collected but suppressed suggested that the operation might have taken as many as 40 or 50 women over a longer period than anyone had realized. Some of the disappearances went back to late 1846, predating the March 1847 start of the pattern that Fletcher had investigated. The women had been specifically targeted for their youth and perceived fertility, traits that commanded premium prices in the Deep South's expanding cotton economy. They'd been torn from their families, drugged and transported like cargo, sold under false names to buyers who'd been told nothing about their true origin. Some of those women likely lived out their entire lives, never knowing which Virginia county they'd originally been stolen from, unable to get word back to the children and husbands and parents they'd been forced to leave behind. The holding facility at City Point had been more than just a warehouse. Documents described it as a compound with separate rooms where captives could be kept isolated, a space where they could be prepared for sale, which likely meant being forced to learn false histories, threatened into silence about their kidnapping, possibly subjected to violence to make them compliant. The facility operated for at least 10 months before being shut down in the wake of Fletcher's investigation. After that, it was cleaned out and converted to storing legitimate cargo. Any evidence of its previous use carefully destroyed. Dr. Estabrook's role in developing the drugging technique turned out to be even more sinister than originally understood. He'd been experimenting with compounds based on opium and other substances, trying to find mixtures that would render people unconscious without killing them, that would leave them confused and disoriented to prevent effective resistance. Several of the women who'd been kidnapped, based on testimony collected decades later from former enslaved people who'd known them, reportedly suffered lasting effects from the drugs, including memory problems and physical ailments that persisted for years. The deaths of the conspirators who'd been at the operational level, Ridgway, Esbrook, possibly others whose fates were never officially recorded, hadn't been coincidental. The plantation owners who'd partnered with Sutherland had systematically eliminated anyone who could testify against them, ensuring that if the conspiracy was ever investigated, all the blame would fall on dead men who couldn't defend themselves. Puig's death at the inlet had been accidental, but it showed the conspirators how vulnerable they were to testimony from subordinates. They'd responded by removing that vulnerability entirely. Thomas Waverly's attempt to expose the conspiracy through the Richmond Enquirer and John Pleasant's death after publishing the story represented the system protecting itself in the most brutal way possible. Men had been murdered to preserve the reputation of Virginia's elite, to prevent a scandal that might have forced society to confront the corruption at the heart of its economic system. The violence wasn't aberrant. It was fundamental to how power maintained itself. But here's what the 1978 discovery also revealed. One of the women who'd been kidnapped had found a way to bear witness. Her name was Louisa, taken from a plantation in New Kent County in July 1847 and sold at a market in Charleston that fall. She'd been purchased by a rice planter named Edward Gresham, whose property was located on one of the Sea Islands near Beaufort, South Carolina. Gresham was by most accounts a brutal owner, working people to death in rice fields where malaria and other diseases killed regularly. But his brutality created opportunities during the chaos of the Civil War when Union forces captured the Sea Islands in late 1861. Gresham fled, and his enslaved workers liberated themselves. Louisa was still alive then, though she was probably in her late 32nds or early 42nds and worn down by years of hard labor. She could have simply enjoyed her freedom and tried to rebuild a life. Instead, she sought out the Union officers who were documenting the property they'd seized, and she told them her story. She described being taken from Virginia, the drugging, the boat trip down the James River, the holding facility at City Point, the sale in Charleston. She provided names and details that she'd held on to for 14 years, waiting for an opportunity to tell someone who might care. The Union officer who recorded her testimony was a captain named William Thorpe from Massachusetts, serving with the occupation forces. He wrote down everything Louisa told him, recognizing it as evidence of the slave system's inherent corruption. Thorpe's report was filed with dozens of other witness statements from formerly enslaved people describing the abuses they'd suffered. After the war, these documents were archived and largely forgotten, gathering dust in government storage until historians began examining them in the 1960s and 1970s as part of renewed interest in Reconstruction-era records. When Louise's testimony was finally read alongside the documents from the magistrate's office, the full story came together. The names she'd mentioned matched names in the conspirators' records. The dates aligned. The descriptions of the holding facility at City Point corresponded with architectural details that could still be verified in 1978. She'd even remembered the false name she'd been given, Mary Jenkins, and historians were able to find a Mary Jenkins in the Charleston market records from fall 1847. Described as being sold from the estate of a deceased Virginia farmer, Louisa's testimony didn't explain everything. There were still gaps, missing pieces, questions that could never be answered. But it provided verification from someone who'd lived through the horror, who'd spent 14 years carrying the truth until she found someone willing to listen. And embedded in her testimony was a detail that none of the other records had captured, what it felt like to be one of the women taken. She'd described the moment of being grabbed, the terror of waking up in darkness with no understanding of where she was, the slow realization that she'd been stolen and sold and that no one was coming to bring her back. She described the other women crying, calling out for children and husbands, begging to be let go. She described the desperate hope that someone would discover what had happened, that the law would intervene, that somehow this nightmare would end. And then she described the gradual crushing of that hope as days became weeks, and they were loaded onto ships and taken further and further.
Or from anything familiar.
That was the truth of what happened along the James River in 1847, not just a criminal conspiracy or a property theft, but a sustained act of terror inflicted on women who had no power to resist, no voice to protest, no protection from a system that viewed them as assets rather than human beings. A conspiracy was possible because the entire structure of slavery created conditions where such crimes could occur and be covered up with minimal effort. The real crime wasn't just what Sutherland and his partners did. It was the system that made their actions feasible and that prioritized protecting powerful men over seeking justice for the powerless. The documents discovered in 1978 created a brief scholarly controversy. Historians debated how widely the findings should be published, whether it was appropriate to name the descendants of the men who'd been implicated, how much weight to give testimony collected more than a century after the events it described. Some argued that the historical record should be as complete and honest as possible, that understanding past crimes was necessary to prevent their repetition. Others worried about unfairly tarnishing family reputations based on the actions of ancestors who'd lived in a different moral context. In the end, the academic papers that were published tended to focus on the operational details of the kidnapping conspiracy while being circumspect about naming names. The plantation owners who'd partnered with Sutherland were generally identified only by initials or described vaguely as prominent Tidewater families. James Sutherland's role was documented but contextualized within the broader economics of Virginia's declining slave economy. The tone was analytical rather than accusatory, focusing on systemic factors that enabled such conspiracies rather than individual moral culpability. Local Virginia historians were less comfortable with the findings. Several published rebuttals questioning the authenticity of the documents, suggesting that the ledger could have been forged, that Louisa's testimony might have been confused or embellished. One historical society member wrote an impassioned defense of the Sutherland family, noting their contributions to Richmond's development and characterizing the conspiracy allegations as unfair demonization of ancestors who couldn't defend themselves. But for people who'd grown up hearing whispered stories from grandparents and great-grandparents, people whose families had been enslaved in Tidewater, Virginia during the antebellum period, the 1978 discovery wasn't shocking. It was confirming the oral traditions passed down through generations had preserved knowledge of women who disappeared, of boats moving on the river at night, of the terror that had pervaded enslaved communities during that year when anyone could vanish without warning. The official historical record was finally catching up to what they'd known all along. The debate about how to remember and discuss these events continues. The 27 or more women who were kidnapped and sold south,